Thank you for that nice introduction, Fred. Very nice to be with you all today. And let's see, Tom has gone already, but I was going to say to him, I think the people in charge of space on our campuses have some of the toughest jobs ever. Talk about the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that you get hurled at you. And it reminded me of the old saw about the three big challenges for every college president, university president, or chancellor, which are sex for the students, sports for the alumni, and parking for faculty and staff. If you're in charge of parking for faculty and staff, you know you have a very, very hard job. I want to start where I think I like to start in talking to the trustees in the room, the board members in the room, and say thank you for the work you do. This is voluntary work. It's complicated work, it's time-consuming work, and you paint a little bullseye on your back when you step into these jobs. As Oku and I were talking, you get that person at the supermarket when you're shopping on a Saturday morning who's really angry about that tuition increase that you and your colleagues just approved, and you'll hear it from those people. Many of you will know this, some of you might not. Higher education around the world is not governed the way it is here. The American system of lay governance, boards comprised of people who are not professional educators, don't come by and large out of the institutions, and are not government employees, is still quite unique. In most countries, the universities are more directly managed by their governments at a variety of levels. And I think that tradition of lay governance that we have here has served us very well and is the reason that for all our challenges, American higher education is still a gold standard around the world. So thank you for doing that. And some of you, especially the new people, will probably have this sense that as you get into your jobs that Mike Leavitt, who is the former governor of Utah and served as the Secretary of Health and Human Services, used to say, which is that public service is full of people who do not know what they're getting into. So, and I'm happy to be here in Austin too. Mary had invited me to facilitate these sessions 2 years ago, which I did, which was my first visit to Austin. And people have told me, and it feels true, that Austin, Texas, and Madison, Wisconsin, where I live, kind of have a similar feel to them. Both the state capitals, both major university towns, both a little separate from the rest of the states where they are located. And a former governor of Wisconsin used to say, Lee Sherman Dreyfuss, who was also a former chancellor of the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point before he became governor, but he used to like to say that Madison is 30 square miles surrounded by reality. So maybe some of you have that sense about Austin and Texas as well. We're going to talk for a little while here about basic roles and responsibilities. Mary has given us permission, because the time's fairly constricted on this first topic, if we want to spill over in the second topic, monitoring and oversight, with a little more on basic roles and responsibilities, we can do that. I'm going to stand here so I can talk into the microphone and they get everything adequately recorded. But I want to make this as useful to you and as conversational with you as we can. So this is, I've got more slides than we will get to. You have all the slides in your packets. Let's focus on what's of interest to you. Feel free to ask questions and start the dialogue as we go along. And what I'll say here about basic roles and responsibilities, let me see if I can work this correctly, and maybe not. Oops. Okay, there we go, got it. What I'll say here about basic roles and responsibilities really represents kind of what I'll call received wisdom over the years from AGB, the Association of Governing Boards, which is exactly what it sounds like, men and women on boards of trustees around the country, their association, and filtered through my own experience in higher education, which you heard a little bit about. That doesn't mean that what I'm going to say is right. It doesn't mean that it works in all institutions, as you know, similarly, or some it might not work at all. So feel free to challenge what I'm saying or recommending, or ask questions as we go along about these basic roles and responsibilities. So let me start here. Boards have ultimate fiduciary responsibility for their institutions. You've got to do two things there, I think, basically under that fiduciary responsibility. One is to ensure that the institution is meeting its mission, and the second is to ensure its long-term viability. It's about mission and about viability. Those are the two basic fiduciary responsibilities you have as a board member. You're also, of course, responsible for all that stuff with the chief executive: recruitment, compensation, performance review of the president of the institution. Arguably, some board members will say the most important thing they do, picking the leader, sustaining that person, supporting her or him, helping them to grow in their leadership role, helping them to work through the inevitable crises that will occur while she or he is the president or chancellor and you are on the board. Third basic responsibility. The board broadly defines the educational mission of the institution, determines generally the academic programs, and is ultimately accountable for the quality of the learning experience. So mission, programs, and quality. Those three things, I think, should be at the core of your consciousness as trustees as you go about your business from day to day and month to month in the trustee role. Fourth essential responsibility. You're overseers of the public trust, and you need to be accountable for meeting the public trust in ways that are appropriate to the mission, back to mission. You will take some hits as a board, as I said before, for decisions that you make, but if you project in doing that accountability, the public is more likely to understand and even support you, even if they disagree on any one decision that the board makes. So finding ways to be accountable, finding ways with your president or chancellor to explain clearly why you've taken a decision that you know will be controversial, for instance. Explaining what you believe the options were you had, and why in some instances you didn't have an easy decision. You had three hard options and you picked the one you thought made most sense for the institution at that time. That kind of accountability, which relates obviously to transparency, is really, really important. Fifth basic role, boards are responsible for ensuring the independence of the institution and for safeguarding academic freedom. So in that regard, I'd like to use the analogy of being a buffer and a conduit, right? So I think sometimes in preserving the appropriate independence of a public institution, you need to buffer some heat. You need to take some of the criticism. You need to try to prevent it from getting in and disrupting the operations of your university or college. On the other hand, there are some times where you probably need to be a conduit for some of that heat. You need to let some of that criticism in. Indeed, you may need to carry some of that criticism into your folks in the institution to say, no, this is really not what the public is telling me we need you to do. Let's talk about this. The trick, of course, is knowing the difference, knowing when you need to be the buffer and then knowing when you need to be the conduit, and that comes very often after some experience on the board and good full board discussions. But I think there's a dual role there. And on the issue of safeguarding academic freedom as part of the safeguarding of independence, you know, if there is no real academic freedom, there's no university, right? On the other hand, academic freedom does not mean any faculty member can say anything he or she wants about anything, even if they have no particular expertise in that thing. What it does mean is that where they have expertise, they need to be free to speak, write, urge solutions, criticize institutions, people or problems from their disciplinary base. And that, you know, academic freedom issue has come to the fore in some controversies, and its relation to freedom of speech, which is a different thing, and we can talk about that difference. And I think in the next couple years, those of you who are board members, and we have presidents in the room too, these are issues that you will likely be dealing with in one form or another, so it's important to get a feel for those. Boards define the terms of shared governance within their institutions through respect for traditions, including delegation of recommendations for academic policy to faculty. This involves a constant back and forth through your president or chancellor with the faculty or the faculty leadership on your campus. And while it is true that in just about every instance in law, in policy and regulation, boards have the final fourth in the back and forth. That is, you get to make the final decision. Wise boards and wise presidents and chancellors exercise it in the spirit of what Justice Felix Frankfurter said about the four freedoms of the university. I think this is a very nice formulation for people to be aware of. And he said the university should have the ability to determine for itself on academic grounds four things. One, who may teach. Two, how it should be taught. Three, who may teach is number one. Two is what may be taught. Three is how it should be taught. And four is who may be admitted to study. So who may teach, what may be taught, how it should be taught, and who may be admitted to study. In Frankfurter's view, those are the four basic freedoms of the university. And boards typically delegate those decisions on those four items to faculty and administration appropriately, retaining oversight of them, but delegating the authority to make those decisions to faculty and staff, with the right to intervene if at some point the board determines that the institution is going off the rails. And that's, again, a difficult decision point when you start to talk about boards getting more deeply involved in those four areas which generally boards should not be deeply involved in. And that goes to a larger point I'd make. Anything that's said here, and most of what you'll hear at this conference, is true most of the time. But there are times of crises when boards do need to be, I would argue, more active than in more normal times. And we can talk about how you decide when you need to be more active in those kinds of situations. Number seventh essential responsibility. This goes to finance, approval of the budget. We heard a good presentation by Mary Knight on the background on that. You established the guidelines for allocation of resources and strategic financial planning as an element of the larger strategic plan for the institution or the system. You know, this is basically, you should be able to follow the money and determine whether you're comfortable with where the money is going, where it's coming in from, and how it's being spent. And in terms of the strategic plan, we'll talk a little more about that when we get to the monitoring and oversight talk in the next session. But universities have extremely complicated budgets, and you should not be afraid, especially as a new board member, to ask questions about that if you don't understand it or something seems off. And in my experience, especially if you're dealing with people who spent their life in the university, who you're asking the questions of, and you're from outside, never having been on a board like this before, it takes several rounds of questions before you get answers that you can really comprehend in ways you need to fulfill your fiduciary responsibility. So don't be afraid to ask. I think a good general rule is really good trusteeship involves asking a lot of really good questions. That in some ways is your main role. So number 8, boards are responsible for reaching out to multiple constituencies, both internal and external, to maintain a respectful and open flow of communication between relevant stakeholder groups. So Who are the stakeholder groups you are inevitably at one point or another involved with? Well, there are students, there are faculty, there are staff, there are alumni, there are donors and prospective donors, there are athletics boosters, there are governors, there are legislators, there are mayors, there are business leaders, there are nonprofit leaders, there are community leaders, there's the media, there's the federal government, and on and on and on. And the university is not a business, although we try to conduct our business side with business-like efficiency. The university is not a business with a defined customer base. I'd say it's rather more like a cult with a far-flung, eclectic following of true believers and heretics, all of whom believe something different about it, in my experience. And you as trustees are key interlocutors among all of these groups, being as you are the single set of individuals who stand squarely on the line between the inside and the outside of the university. You're kind of border runners in that regard. You're innies, outies. Lots of people are going to think you're part of the university. Lots of people think you make a salary at the university. I can't tell you how many times after the Board of Regents at Wisconsin took a tough decision, people would send me an email, send me a text, call me on the phone even sometimes and say, what is wrong with those regents? You ought to fire them, you ought to cut their salaries. And say, well, I don't hire them or fire them, and I can cut their salaries because half of 0 is 0, and it won't make any difference. So people won't understand your role very well, but you are that, you know more about the university than anybody else except for people who work in the university. And you need to be able to represent that knowledge out to the citizens outside the university, and you need to be able to bring the angst, the hopes, the expectations, the criticisms, the praise of the citizens you represent into the university, dealing with all of those stakeholders, both internal and external. That's why it's such an easy job to be a regent. Boards need to understand the legal and regulatory environment in which their institution operates and ensure compliance with all the fiscal, academic, licensing, and other standards. This is not glamorous work. Very often it's laborious, but it's basic and it's so important. You know, we live in an era of transparency. Now social media and the media generally, it can probe into anything within minutes after it happens, and it's a national story. And we need to recognize we're in that kind of environment. If the board and the chancellor are not on top of making sure that the institution is complying with legal and regulatory and other mandates, you will find yourself in a situation where the institution's brand gets damaged. If somebody's not doing that job, not doing it regularly, not doing it well, you'll have a problem. And the last thing you want is as a trustee or a member of a board of directors of any institution or company or university is to have the brand damaged on your watch. 10, and then I'll stop talking and see what questions you have. Conduct the board's business in an exemplary fashion with appropriate transparency, there's that word, adhering to the highest ethical standards, public records law, we talked about this morning already, the currency of policies and practices, and periodically assess the performance of the board, its committees, and its members. So that last responsibility, in my experience, is more often honored in the breach than in the fulfilling. That is, lots of boards don't have any real process for self-assessment. I don't know, Mary, I heard recently that your accrediting agency is now requiring that. Is that true, the regional accrediting body, that the board do self-assessment? So there are more and more of the regional accreditors are starting to say boards have to do that. And this is admittedly a commercial, but I only drop it in because I think it could be useful if all the boards in the state are going to have to start doing this. AGB does have a process to help boards go through a self-evaluation in a way that I think is a good, competent process and is also sensitive to the nature of doing self-evaluation in a public atmosphere where the information you collect to do the evaluation, your analysis of it, your discussion of it, often all needs to be at some level in public. And I think they've developed a pretty good way to do that that's constructive and not destructive. You obviously want it to be, any performance evaluation to be constructive, not destructive. So, all right, well, one last thing very quickly, and this is about the relationship between the board and the president, or the board and the chancellor. There are expectations by the board of the president, there are expectations by the president of the board, and having those be very clear, laying out at the beginning of every year what the expectations are for the president or chancellor of the board in a back and forth conversation between the board and the chief executive, and then having a way to assess that in an annual performance evaluation is obviously very important. The next three kind of fall together in my mind: a common sense of purpose, a shared vision, and a mutually agreed upon plan to implement that purpose. Really critical that the board and the president agree on those. And for the plan, you need to have strategies in the plan, you need to have tactics to achieve the strategies in the plan, and you need to have metrics so you can measure whether you are making progress using those strategies toward the goals of the plan. And they all should be laid out in pretty clear fashion so you all can track it and the president can too. And this relationship is just key to your institution's success. If it's not working, the institution will not be as successful as it should be, simply put. So figuring out ways in your own context to have this kind of very supportive, integral relationship with the president is really important. Often it falls mainly to the board president or board chair, depending on what you call that person, to be the leader in that relationship. And in my experience, again, those folks, the board chair and the president, have to really be in lockstep if things are going to work well. So, what do you think? Questions? Reactions? Yes, Fred.
The second one, the first one is, you said you wanted to give examples, a couple examples where the board may actually a little bit more active, when you pursue a little bit more. Can you give a couple of examples?
Well, yeah, I can. One ripped from the headlines, as they say. Some of you have probably read about the University System of Maryland, and it's a system board. They have institutions, including a large flagship at College Park, and they had an incident where a football player died during practice in a way that it became clear was unnecessary. If certain people on the staff of the football staff had been doing their job more effectively than they were. Tragic situation. So in that instance, normally the supervision of an athletic program is done by the chancellor or the president of the institution and the athletic director. After some back and forth, the system board decided they needed to get involved in the investigation of what happened and how it was handled. And I think, that there were some mistakes made by the board and others in the process of their doing that. But I think their basic instinct to say an instance like this affects the reputation of the whole University System of Maryland, not just College Park. And it's so important that we get this right for College Park's continuing reputation, that we need as board members to figure out a way to know the detail of what's going on and to be involved in the decision-making about what would happen to various staff members as a result of that death. And for those of you, I won't go into the detail of what did happen, but it did get quite messy and wound up with some decisions the board had made initially being reversed, and some people leaving who were going to stay and some people staying who were going to leave. So in a sense, the handling of it wasn't smooth, but I think the initial decision of having some level of direct oversight by the president of the system and the board was correct. Not everybody would agree with that, but I think that's an example I would give.
As a graduate of the University of Notre Dame, what are your predictions of being in the Final Four?
Well, it's been a good year for Notre Dame this year, so we'll see where they go from here. It's been fun, though, to watch them.
Other questions for Dr. Riley? If not, thank you so
Good.
much, Dr.